The palace was made of light and silence. Crystal spires curved into the clouds, humming softly with ancient energy. Every corridor shimmered with golden filaments woven into the stone, glowing faintly like veins of memory. The air inside the throne hall did not move. It was too afraid to. Queen Vaelra sat on a floating throne carved from obsidian and starcore. Her skin shimmered like polished silver. Her eyes glowed the color of distant nebulae. She did not wear a crown. She did not need to. Her presence bent the room around her. No one touched her. No one ever had. The guards who flanked the hall stood 10 meters away, weapons lowered, heads bowed. They had seen what happened to those who stepped too close. They had watched flesh burn without flame, bones crack without sound. Her energy could not be controlled. It did not protect her. It isolated her. That was the curse of power. A single echo broke the silence. Footsteps. Steady. Unhurried. A man was being led into the throne room. He wore no armor, no symbols, just worn gray cloth stretched over broad shoulders and chains that clinked with every step. Dirt clung to his boots. Blood crusted one side of his temple. 2 guards held his arms, though they looked more like escorts than captors. He was not struggling. Queen Vaelra watched him come forward. The room tensed. Even the air seemed to pause. This was the human, Lucas Drive, the one captured on the edge of the Forbidden Zone, the one who had killed 3 patrol drones with a rusted pipe, the one who had refused sedation. He was led to the base of her throne. The guard stepped back, and for the first time in 300 years, someone stood less than 3 meters from the queen. Still alive. "Kneel," the steward said. His voice was firm. Protocol demanded it. No one stood in the presence of the crown. Lucas looked up at the queen, then blinked once. "No thanks," he said. "I don't kneel for tyrants." Gasps rolled through the chamber like thunder made of breath. The guards reached for their weapons, but Queen Vaelra lifted one hand, and everything stopped. No fire, no pain, just stillness. She rose, slowly, every motion fluid, dangerous, impossibly graceful. Her bare feet touched the crystal floor. She walked toward him, one step, then another. Each step peeled silence off the walls, until she stood just 1 pace away. The room watched, waiting for the burn, waiting for him to fall. But he didn't. The energy around her pulsed. It licked at the air, bent space around her body like heat over stone. But Lucas remained standing, breathing, blinking, alive. Her eyes narrowed. "You are not afraid of me?" "No," he said. "You should be." "Why?" "Because no one can survive this close to me." "Then maybe you've never been close to the right people." A pause, long, heavy, and then softly so only he could hear. "What are you?" He looked up at her and answered. "The first person you cannot destroy by staying near." The laboratory was carved into the cliffside beneath the royal palace. Here, no sound of court echoed, no music, no politics, only glass and code and quiet humming machines. The air smelled sterile, sharp with ozone and steel. The walls pulsed faintly with containment energy, as if the stone itself was afraid of what lived inside. Lucas stood in the center of the chamber, still in chains, still unflinching. Around him, sensors floated in midair, scanning his skin, blood, breath. He didn't look at them. He watched her. Queen Vaelra stood behind the primary console, flanked by Chief Biotechnician Zareth, a Zalari with deep blue skin and a voice like cracking glass. Zareth's long fingers danced across the interface, pulling up neural readouts and resonance maps. "It should not be possible," he whispered. "Speak plainly," Vaelra said. "His cells are absorbing your field." "Absorbing it?" "Not rejecting, not resisting, accepting, sinking, like a second skin learning to breathe in your storm." Lucas shifted slightly, still calm, still waiting. Vaelra stepped closer. The room blinked red. Warning flares. Field breach. "Too close," Zareth shouted. "Your Majesty, stop." But she did not. She moved within arm's reach. Lucas did not move away, and the room did not burn. The alarms fell silent. The sensors recalibrated. She stood so close she could hear his breath. She stared into his eyes. "You are not Zalari," she said. "Number. You are not bonded to me. Number." Then why he tilted his head. "Maybe I was broken differently than the others. Or maybe you were not meant to be untouchable forever." She stepped back. Slowly. The room exhaled. Zareth leaned over the console. "I don't understand," he murmured. "No one should be able to stand in your radius and remain intact." "No one." Lucas looked at Vaelra. "Maybe I'm not no one." She turned to Zareth. "Run the tests again, all of them, every sequence, every model. I want to know what changed." Zareth hesitated. "And what if the answer is not with him? What if the answer is with you?" She said nothing, but her fingers trembled slightly. Later, as Lucas was escorted back to his chamber, he turned over her question in his mind. Why could he stand near her? Why had she not burned him alive? He had no scientific answer, only a feeling. That her power wasn't rage, it was sorrow. And maybe for the first time it had found someone who did not run from it. The whispers began in the servant halls. A low murmur passed from kitchen to corridor to guards' quarters, like a wind that knew exactly which doors to slip through. He touched her. He stood that close. And he lived. Some laughed. At first. Then they stopped laughing. Because more than one person had seen it. The light that flickered around her body had dimmed when he approached. Not vanished, but softened. Not because she held it back, but because something in him made it shift. And in the palace of Queen Vaelra, where proximity meant death, that was not just news. That was revolution. By nightfall, it had reached the court. The nobles wore polished exosuits and sapphire threads woven with memory silk. They sipped smoke-laced wine and floated between banquet platforms. But tonight, no one discussed trade policy or planetary alliances. Tonight, they asked the same question again and again. What is he? Who is he? And more quietly, what does this mean for her? Because if she can be touched, then she can be weakened. And if she can be weakened, then she can be replaced. In the deepest chamber beneath the throne wing, a council of bloodline elders met in shadow. 12 of them. Old, terrifying, alive through dynasties. Each one had stood beside Vaelra when her powers first awakened, when her touch had killed without effort, when even her breath could ignite the weak. They had built the cult around her, the myth, the fear. They had made her untouchable, and now one human man had cracked that. He must be eliminated, one said, quietly, cleanly. Not yet, another replied. If we move too soon, she will notice. She already notices, the first whispered. She is smiling. When did she last smile? Silence, they all remembered. The Queen of Fire and Ice did not smile, until now. In her private garden, lit by floating lanterns shaped like glass moons, Queen Vaelra walked barefoot among the glowing vines. Lucas sat on a low bench nearby, his wrists now free of chains. He watched her in silence. You hear it, she said. The court, the empire. The ones who fear change. He nodded. They think I am softening. Are you? She stopped walking, looked at him. Number I am remembering, what it feels like to be near someone and not be alone. He stood slowly. If I'm the crack in the mirror, are you going to shatter? She smiled. Only if you stay to see what breaks. The door to her private chamber slid open without sound. Lucas stepped inside and paused. The air was different here, warmer, quieter. The usual hum of the palace's energy systems faded into something more like breath. He had never seen this room before. No one had. No guards stood at the entrance. No surveillance drones hovered in the corners. Just her. Vaelra stood near a wide window made of layered crystal that filtered starlight into soft silver. She was no longer wearing the ceremonial armor that kept others at a distance. No glowing shield, no glimmering veil of power. Just a simple robe that clung to her like wind, loose and open at the shoulders. Her hair was unbraided, falling in waves that shimmered with the soft pulse of her skin. She looked like someone still made of stars but tired of being the sky. Lucas said nothing. She turned to him slowly. Tonight, she said, I do not want to be a queen. He tilted his head. Then who do you want to be? She stepped closer. A woman. A being, a soul that was never meant to live only in solitude. Lucas met her halfway. The air shimmered around them as her field shifted. The light pulsed. He had felt it before. That static warmth, that heat like distant fire. But it did not push him back now. It reached, curled, welcomed. She raised one hand, trembled slightly, not because of fear, but because this moment had never existed before. And then she touched him. Her fingers grazed the side of his face, and nothing exploded. No alarm sounded. No power surged. Only stillness. Only warmth. Lucas closed his eyes and leaned into her palm. He felt her breath catch. "You are the first," she whispered. "The first to stand and not burn." He opened his eyes. "Maybe you were never fire, Vaelra. Maybe you were light that just never had a place to rest." She let out a sound, half laugh, half broken sigh, then pressed her forehead to his. "I don't know what this means. It means you're not alone anymore. And that scares me. Good. That means it's real." They stood there in silence, not touching in desperation, not clinging for protection, just close enough to finally feel human. Or something close to it. Vaelra whispered into the dark, "If the court sees us like this," he nodded. "They will panic. They already are. Then let them." The Grand Plaza had not seen the Queen in months. Her appearances were rare, calculated, always behind veils of light and protocol. When she moved through the crowds, it was from above, hovering, guarded, remote. But today she walked. No guards, no armor, no distance, just Vaelra and Lucas, side by side, his hand in hers. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind across water. Murmurs rose like steam. Every citizen in the capital had heard the rumors. Some believed them, some feared them. None expected to see them confirmed in daylight. They reached the center of the plaza. The marble beneath their feet was carved with ancient symbols, a space once reserved for royal decrees and wartime declarations. She stopped, raised no voice, gave no speech. She simply looked at her people, then at Lucas, and laced her fingers through his. The message was clear. I choose him, not as a consort, not as a trophy, but as someone I will stand beside, forever. Then came the flash, small, quick, a shimmer from the edge of the crowd. Lucas saw it first. A blade, black, thin, curved like a whisper, thrown, not swung. He moved without thought, pushed her aside. The blade struck, right under the ribs. He staggered. Vaelra screamed, a sound no one had ever heard, a sound that cracked glass. Lucas fell to one knee, blood soaking through his side. Guards finally surged forward, but the attacker was gone, or burned by the pulse of energy that erupted from her body. The light was blinding, every sensor shorted. The plaza shook, and then, silence. Lucas lay in her arms. She knelt beside him, hands glowing, breath shaking. You are not dying here, she whispered. I just got used to you being real. He smiled faint. You're glowing again. She laughed through her tears. Always. For you. Her hands hovered over the wound. Energy sparked, soft at first, then surging. Normally this force destroyed, but now she shaped it, channeled it, pushed it into the torn flesh like a river-turned healer. Lucas gasped. The pain dimmed. The light faded. His breathing slowed, then steadied. He opened his eyes, still alive. Vaelra touched his face and whispered, Never leave my side again. He nodded, wasn't planning to. The plaza remained silent, thousands watching, and then as she rose covered in his blood, not above him, but beside him, the first citizen knelt, then another, and another. Until the entire plaza, once ruled by fear, bowed not because they were told, but because they understood what it meant to love something powerful enough to choose peace. The room was quiet, not silent, but quiet in the way a forest rests after a storm has passed. The kind of quiet that holds its breath around a heartbeat and listens to every exhale like a prayer. Lucas opened his eyes. It took a moment to understand the light was not pain. It was warmth, soft and gold. It flickered gently along the ceiling, flowing from slow-moving bands in the walls. No machines beeped. No tubes tethered him. Only the weight of a heavy blanket and the faint scent of lavender, or something like it. He turned his head. Vaelra sat in the chair beside his bed, one leg tucked beneath her, hair loose, eyes half closed. She looked different in stillness. Not smaller, not weaker, just real. She stirred as he moved. "You're awake," she said softly. "So it seems." Her hand reached forward, then paused. He met it halfway. Their fingers touched. Still warm, still alive. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. "You almost did. But I wasn't going to let a knife ruin your good mood." She laughed. It cracked like sunlight over ice. "You're impossible. Only for you." She brushed his temple. Her energy no longer flared uncontrolled. It pulsed gently, like a tide that knew exactly where to land. "You saved me," she said. "That's not how I remember it. You made 1,000 people bow. I just caught a blade. You gave me something I had never earned, choice. I gave you honesty." She looked away for a moment. "You should know, I've suspended all royal functions." Lucas blinked. "You what?" She stood, walked to the window, looked out over the city where light still glowed from the edges of towers that once trembled under her shadow. "I am not stepping down," she said, "but I will no longer stand above. No titles, no ceremonies, just one voice among many." Lucas sat up slowly. "You're dismantling an empire." "No," she said. "I'm setting it free." She turned back. Her eyes gleamed, not with power, but with presence. "I don't want to be a ruler, Lucas. I don't want to be a god. I want to be someone you can stand beside, without the whole world waiting to catch fire." He reached out. "You already are." They stood together later, out on the balcony. No guards, no ceremony, just wind, just stars, and the sound of a city finally learning how to rest. The amphitheater had never been this full. Not during coronations, not during trials, not even during the wars. Tens of thousands stood in silent rows that climbed the carved stone cliffs like waves frozen in place. Lanterns hovered in the air, casting soft rings of light across the gathering. At the center of it all stood the dais, and it was empty. For now. Then the wind shifted, and she stepped into view, Queen Vaelra. But not as they remembered her. No armor, no veil of power cloaking her steps. Just a simple garment the color of starlight, and hair unbound, catching the breeze. She walked alone to the edge of the platform. No escort, no crown. She looked out over her people. They waited, some afraid, some curious, all listening. She spoke. Her voice was not amplified by technology, but it reached everyone. "You were taught to fear me, to kneel, to praise what you could not touch. You called me goddess. You called me flame. You called me alone. But I am not alone anymore." She turned slightly. Lucas stepped into view, dressed in nothing more than black cloth and calm. He did not wave, did not posture. He simply walked forward and took her hand. Gas echoed through the air. She let them settle. "This man is not your king. He is not your master. He is not here to replace your faith or your fear. He is simply someone I have chosen. Not because he bowed, but because he did not. Not because he begged, but because he listened. Not because he believed I was untouchable, but because he dared to reach." She stepped down from the dais, still holding his hand. They walked together into the crowd. No guards surrounded them. No energy flared. And still no harm came. No fire, no death. Just breathe. And the sound of people kneeling not in terror, but in understanding. Later, as the night deepened and lanterns dimmed, a child approached them. She looked up at Vaelra. "Are you still our queen?" Vaelra knelt. "I am what you need me to be, but you do not have to kneel." The girl reached out and touched her hand, for the first time, without fear. The twin moons drifted slowly through the sky, pale and full, casting soft light over the palace balcony. Below, the city shimmered like a field of fireflies. No sirens, no banners, no orders being shouted through the towers. Just quiet, Just breathe. Lucas leaned against the balcony rail, arms folded, eyes on the horizon. The stars looked close tonight, like they were listening. Vaelra stepped out behind him. She wore no crown, no ceremonial robe, just soft cloth and bare feet. She walked to him in silence. He glanced at her. "You seem lighter," she smiled. "Maybe I finally put something down." He raised an eyebrow. 3 centuries of rule." She shook her head. 3 centuries of pretending I was more than I am." Lucas nodded, and now she stepped closer. "I am someone who can be touched without the world breaking." He turned toward her fully. "It was never you who broke the world, Vaelra. It was the world that convinced you not to reach back." She looked up at him. "And you? You never feared the fire. I've been through enough of my own to recognize when someone's light just needs to be held." She breathed in, then out, slow, even, then placed her hand over his heart. "You know they called it a curse, my gift, my isolation. They wrote stories, made laws, built entire systems to keep people from getting close." He covered her hand with his. "But it was never the power, was it? No. The curse was never the energy. It was the loneliness. And you ended it just by staying." They stood like that in the wind beneath the stars, 2 beings who had no titles left to defend and no walls left to hold. Only truth, only breath, only choice. And if you have stayed until this moment, if your heart slowed when hers did, and your breath caught when they finally stood still, then maybe you have known what it is like to be called untouchable when all you wanted was for someone to reach anyway. So tell us, have you ever let your guard down? Not because it was safe, but because someone finally saw you. Tell your story in the comments, because out here in the quiet corners of the stars, we believe love is not about who kneels, but who stays. Your HFY. Obsession will keep holding that space for you, for us, for those who choose to reach, even when the world says they should not.